Snow fell as quiet as sleep across the old road that ran from the forests of the Wolfswood down to Winterfell's east gate. The flakes were large and slow as cinders, and they buried the ruts of wagon wheels and the prints of boot and hoof until the world seemed to lose all memory of passage. A boy no higher than a hedge waited at the waypost with a bell on his staff and frost at the corners of his eyes. He heard the sound long before he saw it, a far-off murmur like a lonely surf, the groaning of ice, the low thud of a distant heart. When the rider came through the veil of snow, he came hard and lurching, horse blowing plumes, leather straps crusted white. The boy lifted his bell to ring, but the rider's voice broke before the bronze could. "Dead," he rasped. "Last hearth. All dead. The cold walks." The bell did not ring. The boy lowered it. Then he turned and ran. Within the first wall of Winterfell, the coals had been raked and the fires were banked against the night. Yet the courtyards were full of life. Teams slinging stones for scorpions, smiths drawing out dull iron into long black needles, boys with bows learning to brace and aim with gloved fingers. Women stirred great kettles of barley and oaten porridge as dogs paced, tails low, prowling for fallen scraps. Over it all the gods would watched, red leaves combed with rime, the weirwood's face pale and still. Jon Snow heard the words by the east gate and moved through the rush of them like a blade in a sheath. He did not push. The crowd made way for him. Ghost was at his side, a white presence so completely silent that when he moved people felt it as a shift in wind. Jon drew back the hood of his black cloak and knelt beside the rider's horse, caught its bridle, and calmed the creature with a gloved hand. The rider slid half out of the saddle and would have fallen if Jon had not braced him. "How many?" Jon asked. The man's beard was whitened with frost that might have been years. He tried to shape numbers with his mouth, but the cold had eaten most of his words. "Pale," he said. "Not men. Eyes like ice in a well. Lord Umber's halls." The hearths died. Jon carried him to the stewards and gave the order to bring him to the hot pools beneath the broken tower. He sent riders out along the road to Last Hearth, though he knew most would turn back before they reached the ruined holdfast. Then he went to the great hall, where Sansa was hearing petitions, and said only, "Now." When she turned to him across the old oak table, the iron circlet in her hair caught the firelight and made a crown of sparks. She dismissed the petitioner with a promise to keep and waited until the hall was empty save for the hush of snow against the shutters. "How far?" she asked. 2 days on a good horse. The dead in daylight," Jon said. "They're ranging wider. The wall holds, but the cold walks around it, and there are cracks that were not there last year." Sansa looked past him to the banners that hung along the rafters. Direwolf Grey, the Manticore of House Condon, a pine for the Glovers, and a white weeping tree stitched by girls who had not remembered the old gods until winter taught them to pray again. "We have called our banners, and we have salted our meat. We sent every raven south with the truth, and most flew back to their cages with no answer." "What else?" "Fire," Jon said. "We have dragonglass enough to arm spears, and the smiths have set iron collars around the heads, but fire is what they fear." "And dragons," Sansa said. He nodded. It was not his name that lay between them, not the one Bran had brought back from beyond the wall like a cold flame, but another's. Jon felt it like a stone he had put in the mouth of a corpse, a weight necessary and terrible. He never knew whether to swallow it or spit it out. "The raven from Dragonstone," Sansa told him, "says she means to fly north when the sea's still. The Red Woman has returned to her." And there were other words. She hesitated, and in the space of the breath, Jon heard the wind blow clean against the broken tower. "Dreams in the fire, shadows of 3 that were 1. Jon said nothing. The words unsettled him and steadied him in the same moment, the way a cliff steadies a man when he stands too close to its edge. They stood very close to the edge now. Daenerys Targaryen stood on the sea wall of Dragonstone with the wind doing what it could to uproot her. The Dragonmont was a sleeping black tooth behind her, night blooming and old as the shape of this island. The surf came in like shields and went out like spent breath. Drogon clung to the parapet with claws that scored the old stone, his breath a hiss of smoke, his eyes ember bright. Regal's neck curved like an oiled bow as he hissed at the sea. The waves carried sleet, and on some nights they smelled of buried fire. A woman in red stood at her side, as if the wind were nothing and the cold were a story told about someone else. Melisandre of Ashai had come as a shadow at dawn and asked for an hour and had asked nothing else. "In my country," the red woman murmured. "The priests say the world is a great wheel turning in fire. Each spoke is an age, each rim a season. In a few places where the fire burned hottest, the metal ran and changed shape. Men built cities there, and one of those cities set dragons to guard their gates." Daenerys kept her eyes on the sea. "The priests in my country said dragons are fire made flesh. They did not live long. What flames fed them?" Melisandre asked. "What ash cooled them?" "You are blood of the dragon. It is not enough to bear the blood. You must ask the fire what it remembers." The memory came as it often did, not when she summoned it, but when it caught her unawares. A red house with a broken roof. A woman with silver gold hair lifting a child to see a map painted on stone. The wind was glass there. The light had the taste of brine and smoke. And there had been a name, whispered by a man whose mouth tasted of salt. "Show me," Daenerys said at last. They went down through the belly of Dragonstone to a chamber cut of basalt and old heat. The walls sweated. The floor was veined black glass, obsidian polished by the passing of many feet and the rasp of claws. "Melisandre lit no torch." She set a bowl of oil on the floor, bent until her hair swung forward like a curtain, and breathed into the oil as if it were a sleeping child she meant to wake. The oil took the flame and the flame took the room. Daenerys had seen many flames. These were not like those. They were slow and heavy and red as hearts seen through skin. When they moved, they kept the shape of what they had been, and when they stilled you could see the bones of their light. Melisandre said no name aloud. The shape in the fire came of its own ascent, a vast curve like a turning world, a wing that was not a wing but a wall the size of a field, a mouth like a door, and beyond it a darkness not of night but of depth. They called him the Black Dread, and his shadow still lay on cities that had been ground to powder and blown into other men's lungs. The fire showed another more slender, cunning in the curve of the neck, the old green eyes of a serpent that had learned the habits of men, and another, scarred by spears and sand, fierce and eager. The three moved as if bound by a ring of iron that lay beneath them, unseen, old, but unbroken. "Where are they?" Daenerys asked, and the red woman's mouth shaped the smallest of smiles. "Where they were laid down, where bone remembers. Bones of dragons are not bones of men. Men die backward, forgetting. Dragons die forward, toward the fire they came from." Daenerys watched the flames for a very long time. Later, when the wind was harder and the sleet thinner and the hour like a narrowing slit of light, Jon Snow came to Dragonstone with the sea still on him. He had not slept. He went with Davos up the steps to the great hall while she waited on the dais, not upon a throne, but standing, one hand on the scaled stone that rose like a dragon's spine. He bowed his head and spoke in a voice like the winter he had carried. He told her the wall held and did not hold, that the dead were patient and the living were not, that the cold had learned the roads men had made. He did not ask again for things she would not give freely. He simply told her where the cold would be tomorrow, and what it would do, and what it did not yet know. She listened. She had learned that listening is a kind of war. "Your ravens fly faster than my ships," she said at last. "I will not ask the sea to drown them." "Bring your fire," Jon said. "Bring the dragons. I will bring the rest." He did not look at her as he said it. He looked past her, to the hall with its long basalt ribs, to the old fire under the mountain that warmed the chamber through the oldest of the stone's veins, to the window that opened toward a sword of light and waves that wore the shape of teeth. Drogon lifted his head as if he understood, as if the language of men had at last introduced itself to him. When Jon went down to the caves with a lantern and a satchel, he did not take anyone. He walked where the floor was slick and the air warm and the lamps burned with a softness that made you think of skin. At the end of a tunnel, he found a chamber he had not seen. It was narrow and tall as the inside of a horn. The walls bore scratches like script, not letters he knew, though he had learned some from the rare septon who had wintered at Castle Black. The floor sloped to a bowl in which glass had cooled to a ripple. He raised the lantern. There, in the stone above the bowl, was a thing that had been covered over by a skin of black glass. He touched the glass. It was not cool. It shivered under his fingers as if it were something breathing. He picked up a shard of obsidian from the floor and drew it across the skin. The black sheet cracked in a circle and came away like a scab. Beneath it, in a niche, lay a horn. It was not like any horn he had seen on the wall, fashioned of goat or aurochs. The thing had the look of a beast's tooth that grew on one side and hollowed itself as it grew. The surface was smooth, but for lines that spiraled with a purpose he did not know. Along the rim were glyphs that were shapes of fire just before it turns back into wood. If he held the lantern in a certain way, the horn showed colors in its black, as if it were made of frozen breath. He did not blow it. He took it back up to the light. Melisandre met them on the stairs and looked at the horn, and a small smile flickered and died on her lips. "Not a thing to be used lightly," she said. "Not by men who wish to keep their lungs." "I wasn't planning to," Jon said. He found Davos's eyes and saw the man's suspicion as plain as any sword. "Then why take it?" Davos asked. "Because we don't get to choose where the fight arrives," Jon said. "Only whether we are there." It was not blown that day or the next, but in distant places men and women were uncovering other old things from other black places, and the world was arranging itself. In Old Town, the high tower stood like a finger asking an old question. The tower was white in the day, gray at dusk, and black at dawn. Its beacon still burned when there was oil and wind, and on clear nights ships could see it like a step to heaven from far out near the whispers of the summer sea. Beneath it, in a round chamber where the stone was so polished the light seemed to return softer than when it left, Samwell Tarly turned a page with care and had to stop himself from licking his finger. "You mustn't ever do that in this place," Archmaester Brose had told him when he came. "It makes pages remember tongues. One tongue is bearable. 100 will turn a codex to clotted milk." Sam did not lick. He read. The book had been stitched in the freehold before it broke, its thread a tight black that looked like hair. The title was a thing like a flame braided into a knot. It was about horns. "Husband," Gilly whispered from the other side of the table. Where she sat with the babe, she refused to call anything but Sam. "You are making that face." "I always make a face when I read," Sam said without looking up. "Not that one," Gilly said. "The one you wore when you killed the thing in the tunnel." He looked up. Her hair had grown out and she had tied it with a ribbon the color of new apples. She exasperated and heartened him with the same suddenness. "The book says the freehold fashioned 3 horns at the height of their art," he said. "Not like Dragonbinder." And here he remembered a pirate with a blue-lipped smile describing a horn that burned men from within, but older and meant not to bind beasts to men, but to waken fire in places where it sleeps. "Like the lighthouse," Gilly said, and looked up as if she had heard the high tower breathe. "Like Dragonstone, like the God's Eye, like the Hellholt," Sam said. "Those are places," Gilly said, proud to show she knew. "Where hard things melt, where hard things remember how they were made," Sam corrected gently, and Gilly made a face at him that meant she heard but would not admit it. "The 3 horns had names," he went on, "but they give them like riddles. The first was black on black, called the breath between. The second was green-black, scaled like a fish, called the depth that looks up. The third was white within black, called the egg-laid last. And when they are blown at 3 fires at once." Gilly bounced the babe and waited. "Well, they said it once in High Valyrian and once in the tongue of guys and once in the old tongue of the Rhoynar, and then they stopped writing and carved a picture of a dragon's skull," Sam said, slightly wild. "I think it means the fires will remember the greatest of their shapes." Gilly looked at the babe. "That sounds like waking. You better not wake anything that isn't our boy. You know how he is when he misses a nap." Sam went to Lord Leighton Hightower with the book under his arm and his heart quaking like a pudding, and found the old Lord High in his eyrie with his daughter Malora. a pale woman with hair like rope, both of them reading by the light of a glass candle that had no flame and could not warm your hands but made your eyes hot. "My lord," Sam said, "we must light the great lamp with all the oil you have left, and mix in the Green King's piss the alchemists send to madmen." Lord Leighton's eyebrows went up, and Malora looked at the glass candle as if Sam had told it to sing. "Why?" Lord Leighton asked. Sam told him. He spoke too fast and then too slowly. He left things out and put them back in places they did not fit. He thought of the riders, the others, on starved horses whose hooves left no prints, and the dead men with fingers like chilled candles, and he wanted to push all the words into Lord Leighton's hands and say, "Here, do something with these." When he had done, the old lord lifted his gaze to the high ceiling and said, almost to himself, "To be a lord of Old Town and never light the tower for anything but trade. I am 80 years old and I have bored fine men to death. This will be my apology." Malora laughed like a rope creaking. "And if we make a beacon they can see in Valyria itself, father? Then the ruins will know we still live," the old lord said. "And perhaps that will be our salvation or our doom." He looked at Sam. "Let us prime the lamp, Tarly. I have never loved my city in fear." They lit the beacon with oil and wildfire in a ratio the alchemists would have called folly and dreamers would have called faith. When the flame went up, it went up like a mountain does not rise but is simply there after misparts. The light changed the faces of those who watched it. Men who had spent their lives mapping tides and counting barrels looked for a moment like boys who had opened a forbidden door. The green in the heart of the fire made the white walls of the tower look like the belly of a great beast. In the streets below, the poor gathered and crossed themselves and listened for horns that had not yet been blown. Sam descended to the round chamber with the polished stone and set the black horn, breath between, upon a plinth of basalt. He did not intend to blow it. That work he had given, with apology of 100 pages, to a nameless man condemned for a murder he had not admitted to. The man was brave or broken, which is sometimes the same. He listened once and nodded and told Sam he wished to die useful. Sam went away and did not watch. When the horn sounded, the sound was not a sound. It was a decision the air made, and men imagined the noise afterward. It filled the tower and went up it and out with the wild green light, and ships at anchor in the whispering sound began to swing on their cables as if a current had turned inside the rope. At Dragonstone, the horn that had waited under obsidian was laid beside a great fire in the old hall. Grey Worm stood with a spear planted but down to keep back the press of men curious enough to die for curiosity. John did not take the horn in his hands. He watched a boy of the kitchens blow it with all the breath he had and cry out at once, for it had cut him within. He watched another do it and feel the same blade, and would have stopped it if Melisandre had not put a hand on his. "Not you," she said. "Not her. It answers fire, not flesh." It was a hard thing, but the boy who had played with the hearth embers ever since he had learned to crawl took the horn without fear. He was no one's child in particular, a cook's helper whose name had been lost when his mother took ship in Volantis and never found land. The horn did not kill him. It made him old and young at once, and he lay down trembling by the fire and said he could hear the mountain breathing. The horn sounded. The hall trembled. The Dragonmont exhaled in a long, low sigh that every man felt under his feet, as if the island had decided to rise. The sound came again. The mountain did not wake all at once. It woke the way an old warrior wakes when his name is called 3 times from the door at night, as if the sleeper had never slept, and the world had been waiting for him to open his eye. The Dragonmont opened its eye. The first inkling of it was the smell, not smoke or ash, but a sweetness like charred fruit, the smell of stone remembering it was once liquid. The second was a tremor in the chapel where the 7 had once stared with placid faces at a king who burned them. The third was a darkness that moved. It moved in the mountain, and it moved in the hall, and it moved across the faces of men and women and dragons like a thought. When the dragon came, he came as if the mountain had been designed to be a door and the beast the key that fit it. Balerion was not merely large. He was the answer to any attempt to describe him. The dragon that had broken cities like bread and cast shadows as far as orchards could stretch came out of stone, as if stone sorrowed to release him. His wings unfurled over the long slopes of the mountain and covered the sky to the east with an absence of light. His scales were not black, but the color that is darker than black, the color of a hearth before it receives new wood. His eye found the hall because the hall was where the voices had come from, and for a moment all those who stood in that place understood they had been seen by something that had once watched the freehold become what it became, and had refused to lower his head. Drogon screamed as dragons scream, a ripping rapture. Rhaegal snapped his wings taut and launched himself, claws digging out chips of stone the size of a man's hand. They were not cubs then, not pets or engines, but princes of flame meeting their elder. They circled the great head that rose out of the mountain and roared again, a challenge and a greeting both. Balerion turned and lowered his head until his mouth was level with the parapet where Daenerys stood flanked by Unsullied. Little chips of glass rattled to the stone. The warm, wet smell of old fire surrounded her. He did not bow. He did not need to. He watched. She felt no fear that did not exhilarate her. She set a hand on Drogon's neck, and the black dragon she knew lifted his head as if he would climb upon the Greater's jaw and go inside him to learn how to be old. Then Balerion moved his eye and fixed it on Jon Snow. It was not the first time Jon had been measured by something older than men. The old gods had watched him through the red leaves. The cold had weighed him, but this was not that. This was the evaluation of a weapon regarding a hand it might fit. He did not step forward. He did not step back. Ghost moved a pace and stood between Jon and the long dark slit of the dragon's gaze. After a moment the wolf yielded, not to the man, but to the knowledge that he faced fire that would char bone to memory. Jon laid his hand on the hilt of his sword, which was an old habit and not a threat. Balerion exhaled, and the breath went past Jon like an old wind and made him feel 10 years younger and 1,000 years older. In that breath, there was the Sea of Valyria before it boiled, and the little houses under the cliffs of Dragonstone when the stone was first poured, and a boy with a wooden sword who had thought any man who could lift a steel blade must be a hero. Jon closed his eyes on the sting of it. When he opened them, he knew he could climb the ladder set against that neck and hold on. He did not. Not yet. Elsewhere the sound that was not exactly sound reached other places where fire waited like a memory with a hand on your sleeve. At the god's eye, the frozen skin of the great lake smoked as if holes were being pushed up by something that had been holding its breath and now meant to breathe. A party of outlaws bent under loads of stolen barley near shore saw the steam rising where the ice was thin in summer and shrank from it. Arya Stark watched them from between the gray trunks of winter trees and felt the wolf in her raise her nose to a scent that had nothing to do with men or barley or fear. She had come to the god's eye for reasons that did not know their names yet. The thing that rose from the lake did not care. The ice heaved and split in a long gape. A shape the size of a hall came up out of the black water, shining as if it were oiled. Vhagar was not as huge as Balerion, but size is not everything to a predator. She came up with her eyes open and her mouth closed and the water running off her scales like molten coins. The flea-bottom stories made her sound like a crone. The truth that rose from the lake was lithe and quick and old enough to know the difference between an army and a meal. She beat her wings twice, and the second time she did not touch the water again. She rose through her own steam and made a sound that flattened grasses along the lakeshore as if a giant hand had pressed them. Arya watched her circle the Isle of Faces once, twice, as if considering a story she had heard about that place. Perhaps the weirwoods whispered to dragons too. Vhagar headed north like certainty. In Dorne, at the Hellholt where the sands keep old heat even at the lip of winter, a half-buried skull the size of a wine cask lay under a vault of sun-baked brick. Around it, 1,000 jars held the dust of House Euler's dead. The skull had been mare-axes, and spears had slain her, and the Dornish had spoken of it for 100 years as if it had made them immune to dragons ever after. A tremor like the smallest of laughs went through the vault. The skull settled. The brickwork creaked as the sand under it shifted. Long after the first horn sounded in Old Town, after the high tower's green-white light had written itself on the low cloud that reached even this far in a dark ribbon, the vault exploded. Men and women ran to the walls as sand poured from the broken arches like grain from a split sack. A neck armored against bolts lifted out of the sand as a dragon digs itself free the day after it hatches. Merix's head was wedge-shaped and scarred with all the old wounds the spears had made, and yet none of those wounds remained. She shook sand and old centuries from her back, and her first roar in this age went out over Dorne like a war cry someone had been waiting to answer. The Eulers stood on their ramparts with their hair blowing and their mouths shut. They had killed a dragon once. This was not that dragon. The truth had come back to correct their story. She turned her head toward the north. She rose. Sand spun in gyres below her like the sea, and the farms along the Greenblood sent up the smaller roar of the people who work and watch when the world changes on them. In the red keep the skull of Balerion had been moved from the Great Hall in a king's day to a cellar by a usurper who had wanted to drink without feeling looked at. Cersei Lannister took comfort at times from the quiet procession of bone in that grotto. She walked it like a queen past the image of ancient power, as if they were courtiers who would shift and kneel as she passed by. Qyburn followed, breathing softly. "The Iron Bankers are patient," Cersei said without turning. "But I am patient with patience. Why should patience be a virtue? There are only two kinds of time, Qyburn, now and too late. Wisdom," Qyburn murmured, which was a word he applied like unguent, and the skulls looked at them both. She stopped at the largest. Its sockets were great dark rooms you could step into. There were candles set in sconces along the walls, but not in here. She had forbade it. The shadows were better. She put her hand on a tooth taller than a man's forearm and leaned as if she meant to push the skull back to the wall. It had moved in recent years on its iron rails. Dust whispered. "Sometimes I think all of this will crack at once," she said. "The city, the river, the box of bones, my brother's head. As if the Lannisters had mistaken glass for stone. As if the world answered her. A fine sound went through the skull. Not a crack, the opposite. A tightening. As if bonds had been eased and a thing within had decided to breathe." She snatched her hand away. Qyburn took a step back so small only the cleverest eye would mark it. Wax dripped. There was a smell like a struck nail. The skull did not shatter. It sighed. And in that sigh the air in the cellar grew warm enough that the smallest spiders came out from between stones and curled. "Fetch the alchemists," Cersei said, more quietly than she had intended. "Tell them I want every pot on the walls and every scorpion tightened. We will put a bolt through the eye of any story that dares to fly above my city." When Qyburn had gone, she stood very still. On the floor around the great skull were the prints of men who had sprinkled sand and ash in grooves to show its size. She looked down. Ash that had not been there before lay in a fine circle around the skull. She stepped away from it. Above, the bells of the city rang for a fire in the street of silver that had no obvious cause and was out in a moment, as if the flame had simply remembered itself and gone home. The north received the dragons with fewer words than other places. One night men at the rills looked up from the long work of chopping green ice in the river to make room for boats and saw a shadow move across the stars. They took their caps off. It seems silly to take a cap off to the sky, but the gesture mattered to them, and they did it. In White Harbor, fishers pulled in empty nets and blamed dragons and felt better for having someone to blame. The night fort heard the sound later than the rest, because the sound that was not a sound disliked old stories and took the long way around them. When it arrived, it sank into the stones and made the soup in the pot over a hearth taste briefly of rust. Jon rode with 1,000 men to the Bar Rolands because the dead were marching there and because the dead liked old stones and old kings, and if you set yourself between old kings and what harms them, you sometimes find courage you forgot you had. He did not tell the men that Vhagar had flown over the God's Eye and that Meraxes had torn herself out of Dorne's sand. Those things would either be true where it matters or not. He did not tell them he meant to mount the Black Dread. Words did not make that more possible. They came on the whites in a stand of dead willows by a half-frozen stream. The first rank of men taunted and beat their shields, and through torches the wind blew back in their faces. Jon did not tell them to be still. Men do not fight in silence. He rode Ghost like a thought through the trees and cut, and Longclaw took the heads of 3 dead men in one heartbeat because the dead do not guard their necks. The other's nightmare had been here once and gone. It was like coming back to an old house where the roof had been patched, but you could still smell the fire. They would have been pressed if the sky had not gone dark. Vagor came down on the left like a falling wall and slid along the edge of the willows and poured a long, clean river of fire into the stream until the water boiled, and the wights that had been walking through it went up like straw dipped in oil. The men turned their heads to see what had put the sun out and saw the disk of the dragon's body pass and the long tail flick and the wake of heat lift their cloaks. No one cheered. There are moments you do not cheapen with noise. They watched as the dragon rose and went north again, following the smell of cold. Meraxes came 2 days later to the high road that runs between the Barrowlands and Winterfell, not to fight, but to look. She circled twice, low enough that men could see the old scars and the armor of scales along her breast, and she roared once and left. There is a sort of looking that is a promise, and men felt it in their hands when they went to close them and found they were shaking. Balerion did not hunt in the north at once. He had other work. He flew above the sea like a black continent with a mind. Ships moved under him. Men in those ships lifted their faces and shields. In some places the great shadow darkened the deck, and the men felt the air grow warm enough to make the pitch sweat in the seams between planks. A few fell to their knees and crossed themselves and remembered prayers they had not used since the last harvest. A few were so frightened they laughed. Men are like that around awe. They make a small noise so they can hear themselves again. When Balerion turned toward the east, the sky went with him. He did not hurry. There is a pace older than lending itself to urgency. He did not go to Valyria. He went just shy of it, to the place where the sea is full of whispering and the water throws up bubbles that taste of ash. He looked down. Something looked up at him from the deep. It might have been the shadow of his passing, or the reflection of his eye, or some other ancient thing that had found a way to wait this long. He let a ribbon of dark flame fall, a seam of night knitting itself, and the sea shook in a circle like a great beast turning over. Then he went west again, because the west was where the cold was walking. Euron Greyjoy watched the sky from the deck of a ship with black sails and laughed for a long time when Balerion passed. "Yes," he said to no one and to everyone. "Yes, and now." Victarion's hand smoldered where he had grabbed the burning horn once, and it had never stopped hurting, and that made his face an ugly mask that pleased Euron. "Blow the horn again," he told the man he could afford to kill, and they blew it, and the sound they imagined afterward tasted of blood and defeat. In Old Town, the bell tower noted the wherries scudding upriver at night more numerous than ever, and in the citadel a glass candle showed Sam an image of snow falling through a greenish light, as if the world had been dropped into a goblet of wine with a little wildfire. He wrote letters with hands that ached and thought of his father, who had wanted him to be a sword in a world that trusted words more than swords, and then less and then more again. He wrote to Jon. The horns had sounded, the 3 fires had answered, the old dragons remembered themselves. He did not write what else the book had said, the part he kept under his thumb like a secret coin. If the 3 returned, one would have to become the fire it came from, and the return would only be as real as the need that called it. Gilly told him not to carry that coin. "You'll spend it at the first trinket shop you find," she said. "Let someone else be poor." "Who?" Sam asked softly, thinking he knew. Gilly did not answer. She blew out the candle and drew him to bed, and they lay a long time listening to the city murmur to itself. Winterfell received its own visitation. Balerion came at dusk, when the peach light had fallen below the ramparts and Sansa was on the battlement with her cloak pulled close and her hair full of wind. She felt the first sign as a pressure in her ears, the way a storm far away can pinch your hearing. Then the shadow blotted the stars that had just begun to show. A blot so large and whole the mind refused it at first, like a traveler refusing a closed door. He did not land in the yard. There was no yard big enough. He perched on the outer wall where the ground fell away toward the dead forest and the godswood, his great claws finding a hold in stone that had never known such grips, and his forelegs bent slightly and his wings folded up in a slow-rising curve. The wall took his weight because the wall had been built by men who knew they would live under the sky forever, and when you think that way you put more stone in. Sansa did not run. She did not call for guards. She put a hand on the wall, not because she would fall, but because the ancient human gesture of touching a thing that touches the ground steadies the body. The dragon turned his head and looked along the wall with one eye, and because men have read poetry, they call a dragon's eye golden. But this was not the yellow of coins or wheat. It was the color of old honey seen through smoked glass, with a darkness behind it too dense to be only night. "Your Grace," said Brienne at her shoulder. Sansa had not heard her come. "If you would step back." Sansa stepped back one pace and then another, never turning her eyes from the dragon. She had seen the heads in the red keep once, a long time ago, and had felt a little girl's fear curdle into disappointment at the bones. This was the opposite of that. She felt something like hope, which was a feeling she had learned to mistrust, as one might mistrust a sweet, unfamiliar drink pressed on you by a queen. Then Jon's shout went up from the yard, and she saw him running for the gate. He did not shout at the dragon. He shouted for a rope and for a long hook, and the old headsman's ladder. When the men brought it, he slung it over his shoulder, and in 3 violent motions, he had set it against the wall where the dragon's shoulder rose like a cliff. It was not long enough. Men ran to fetch another. Ghost went up the first rungs before Jon and stood a moment on the stone beside the dragon's talon and looked up, and his white ears laid back, and he made a small sound like breath through teeth. The dragon watched that, and when Jon climbed the ladders and reached for the ridge of scale and got a handhold that would strip the skin from lesser hands, Balerion did not move to shake him off. Jon got his knee on the top of the wall and then up, using the dragon's scales as if they had been made to be holds and not armor. He settled in a notch between great bones where the neck rises and joined, for a moment, everything larger than himself. He did not pull the dragon's head. He did not kick. He set his hand to the base of the neck, above the old place where the neck meets the skull, and he said aloud into the wind the old words he had heard once from a Targaryen who had not known what she was. "Sovs," he whispered, and forgot he needed to know High Valyrian to mean it. Balerion moved. He did not bow and did not rise. He uncoiled like a rope and took the stretch of himself for the sky, and the ancient wall took the sudden absence of him like a breath men found together. He climbed. The air grew warm around Jon and then hot, not in a cruel way, but like being pressed to the breast of a giant. The world dropped away. The winter town became a toy, and then not even that. Jon felt no dizziness. He felt a clarity that was almost like loneliness, and then he did not feel lonely anymore. They flew north. The first battle where all the dragons met was not at Winterfell, but at Eastwatch, where the sea gnaws at the end of the wall as if the taste of old magic pleases it. The dead had come along the shore in a long cracked line the color of old tallow. The sea spilled up frozen fingers, and the dead stepped around them with the patient courtesy of men who had all the time in the world. The wall above Eastwatch was not perfect. It had never been perfect. It was a miracle made by men who do not make miracles, which is to say, it had seams. The dead like seams. The watch put fire in every brazier, and sent their few arrows down like pebbles thrown into a flood. The men on the seaward side watched the far edge for ships that might bear friends and saw only a band of water darker than the sky. Then the wind turned, and the smell came, the smell the others bring when they walk on the sea, sharp with a nothing that makes eyes water. There were specters among them, knives of blue light woven into their ranks, and they turned their heads all together as if listening to a master that was not present. Balerion came first and blackened the shore. His flame was not a color men had given a name to because men generally name what they can use, and this was not that. It fell and lay along the beach like a ship so long the eye could not see both ends, and where it lay the snow fled and the sand turned briefly to glass and then to smoke. Whites that entered it went as if a line had been drawn across a map through their bodies. The specters moved through it more slowly, shedding ice, and when they came out the other side they had no eyes. Drogon came next, a living sword cutting along the line Balerion had scorched, and where his fire met the black it flared red and the two flames laughed at each other. Regal swooped, a green crash of motion, and blew fire sideways into a knot of dead men trying to clamber onto a tower. Men watched him from the walk with faces like boys at a fair, and then felt ashamed for being glad, and then felt, for once, that shame was a stupid thing. Vagor turned half over in the air and poured her fire into the sea, and walls of steam went up like the curtains in a lord's bed. And men saw the top of something that had been moving under the water and lost it again. Mare Axes with her wide wedge-shaped head came in lower than the rest and raked the beach, and her flame took a grove of piled timbers the dead had brought for ladders and turned them to a rush of bright lines, each line a shrinking argument. It was not a battle long enough for songs or short enough for laments. The dead did what they always do, which is die and rise and come on. The dragons did what they were made to do. The wall held. In the night after, men who had killed whites slept for 2 hours, if at all, and dreamed of falling up into a warm dark. And when they woke, the taste of it was in their mouths. Jon did not sleep. He stood on a tower walk and watched the sea throw back light the dragons had made, and felt Balerion breathing under him where the dragon had slid his great chest against the wall to rest. He thought of many things. Of the boy at Winterfell who had blown the horn and lay now in a bed under 4 firs, sleeping as if he had dug all the graves in the bar Rolands and filled them. Of the glass candles men were finally admitting had never been gone but had simply gone dark. Of the way a wolf will watch a fire and tolerate it and then roll closer, because there is a sort of courage in heat. He did not think of being a king. He was not a king of anything he could count. When Daenerys came to stand beside him in the wind, her hair was braided down half her back with leather and strips of black cloth. Her cheeks were raw from flying. She did not ask if he had slept. They looked at the sea. Words between them had thickened and thinned a dozen times. There were still words, and they used them. "The North saw him," she said. "Your sister saw him." "She has seen many kings and bent for none," Jon said. "She would not have had to bend when he came," Daenerys said, and the corner of her mouth moved in something not quite a smile. "Balerion does not ask for knees. Does anyone?" Jon asked, not mocking. "That depends on how strong their back is," she answered, and reached to set a hand on the frozen stone of the crenel. She held it there until her fingers hurt, and then she removed them because pain has its own pride. He turned to tell her about Sam's letters, about horns with names and debts the world meant to collect, and realized that in the hour he had just lived he had not been a man who knew the names of horns. He had been a man on the neck of a thing that did not name itself, and had felt for the first time that perhaps it is enough at times to be an instrument if the music is worthy. "Tomorrow," he said, and meant it the way a man might mean, "I will walk into that river." They moved the host to Winterfell anyway. It is not a bad thing to put an old stone between yourself and a cold wind, even if you have an older fire on your side. The living came. They came out of the hills dragging sledge loads of wood nobody could afford to burn. They came with goats and without goats, with children and without them, carrying the look of a man who means to fight even if what he will swing is the length of chain that once held back a pig. Sansa counted stores with a fierceness that made men step aside in corridors when they saw her, as if she carried a sword sharper than steel. Tyrion Lannister arrived from the south with a face like a coin nobody would accept, and he was useful, which is all that can be said for a man in winter, and more than can be said for most. He worked the numbers and took the insults people offered him and turned those insults into useful heat. Bran watched the sky with eyes that did not always belong to him. Arya appeared like a mark of punctuation in a sentence spoken too long without breath and went away again, and when she was gone men found they had more knives than before. Gendry Baratheon built the scorpions until his hands bled, and Davos sewed the leather for their sleeves and thought of a boy his king had once promised him and had not given him, and then had not lived long enough to give anyone anything. Sam and Gilly came up the king's road with carts of paper wrapped in oilskin, and when the carts burned the men warmed themselves on the words. Sam minded that for a moment, and then he did not. The right words are only the words you can keep. They made a plan to stand by a plan when plans failed. They fetched the old men into the hall and the boys out of it, because old men can hold a gate and boys will run to the wrong noise. The women who could shoot were given arrow-making at night and arrows at dawn. They laid dragonglass on the points of spears and sanded the edges until the glass grew a dull kind of hungry. They set barrels of pitch along the walls not because it would hold, but because fire at your side when the cold comes helps men stand. In the God's Wood the red leaves gathered snow along their edges, and Bran sat under the heart tree and watched his breath rise and go out. When he went into the wood he did not go far. It was not a time to take long journeys. He traced the roots of the trees, which are the roots of the world, and felt where they ran cold and where they ran hot. He felt the weirwoods at the Isle of Faces rise up like men who have slept badly too long, suddenly waking to a purpose. He felt a thing like wind moving under ice where there is no wind. He felt the cold think. He saw a man with a crown of snow on his head standing in a circle of stones in a place where the blue light does not go out. He saw a woman with hair like smoke lean over a bowl of oil. He saw dragons. He did not see the end. That would have been too easy, and the gods loved their stories too well to spoil them. Before the dead came, Cersei sent a raiding fleet up the Mander to burn Old Town. Euron captained it. He went because he had wanted to swim in that city since he was a boy and had watched his uncles throw a priest into the sea for marrying a man to his brother's widow. Euron loved wanting as a pig loves mud. He was bored when he was not afraid, and he had not been afraid in years. The fleet came up the river with black sails that made men on the banks think of funerals. The Hightower light burned through the day with a green heart and a white rim, and the city's walls were manned with men who had not had to defend anything but their purses in 100 years. They were afraid, and it made them noble. Euron ranged his scorpions on the decks and aimed them at the great light because to him it was a challenge or a friend or an enemy or a woman. He did not mind which, so long as it saw him. He sent a bolt through air hot from the beacon. The bolt hissed, wood and iron burning in a heat it did not know how to carry, and came on anyway and struck the lip of the beacon and stuck there and burned like an accusation. Euron Loghead. It was then that Vagr turned from the north and Meraxes from the east and came down together on the river. It had not been arranged. It did not need to be. The old dragons felt the river the way men feel veins in their wrists. The first pass set fire to 3 ships at once, and men who had trained for this exact end by keeping water in their barrels found the water boiling before they could throw it on the wood. The second pass took the masts of 2 more and made a forest of burning trees that fell into the river and made a weir of fire. The third pass was not a pass at all. Vagr came to hover, great wings beating a great ponderous beat that still the river could not match, and she opened her mouth over Euron's deck. He looked up into the mouth of something so large boats have been lost in mouths like that of lesser creatures and, for the first time in too long, felt fear. He laughed into it. It had always been a joke to him that death would come in some form he could love. Arya Stark landed lightly on the deck behind him and said his name into his ear. Then she cut his throat. He looked surprised and tried to see her face, to put a name to the eyes behind the eyes. But his legs were already failing him, and he fell to the planks that were as hot as news and bled there until Vagr's fire blew the blood to steam and the man away. Old Town was not burned. The beacon kept burning. The men on the walls marched away from their fear as if it had been a ditch they had leapt. After, Sam and Gilly climbed the high tower and stood by the great lamp and watched the dragons fly away hollowing the sky, and Sam thought of the thing he kept under his thumb. "You're making that face again," Gilly said. He closed his eyes. He imagined taking the coin from under his thumb and flicking it into the light. He did not do it. The dead came to Winterfell like a silent army of statues that had decided to take a walk. They brought their own weather. The storm rose against the walls not from the west or the east but from the plain in front of the gate, as if the cold itself were stepping forward and bringing a wind with it in its pockets. The scorpions on the walls iced up in an hour, and men lit coals under them and covered them with cloth and cursed and cried and kept working. The dead ran into the pits the living had dug, and men toppled burning logs onto them from the walls and watched the dead climb the burning logs to come up out of the pits. Daenerys rode Drogon and burned and circled again, and the dragons in the sky wrote the same words over and over. Not yet. Balerion came like night at noon and laid an arc of black fire along the front of the host that sputtered and clung and died where the cold folded over it like a curtain. The specters moved in that cold. Their eyes were knives. Arrows did not know where to land in them. Jon rode Balerion down into the storm. It was like diving into a winter lake and finding breath there anyway because the air around the dragon was his own. He looked for the place where the cold was thickest. Not the densest cluster of dead whites have gravity of their own, but the place where the cold was thinking. He saw it as something that happens to vision when you stare too long at snow. You begin to see things move where nothing is. He flew at that. Balerion slammed into something that was not exactly there, and the world made a sound like ice snapping from a great distance. A figure on a pale horse appeared for a moment and then did not. Longclaw answered for Jon the way a well-trained hound answers. It found a shoulder where there might have been a shoulder, and the arm bent backward at a wrong angle and then reassembled. Jon felt no anger. He was too cold for anger. He felt a purpose so simple it might have been sleep. Do this until there is nothing left to do. In the yard men fought men they had known, and the dead do not fall like the living. Sansa stood at the inner gate with a spear and did not pretend to be brave. She was frightened, and she held the spear anyway and told boys to light kettles and pour. And they poured the oil, and it fell and set hair and clothing on fire that would never burn to ash because the wind kept blowing and making the fire green and smaller and meaner. Brienne took a step forward and lent her shield to a boy who had lost his. The boy lived and would later tell the story and misremember it in a way that made it better. Tyrion stood on the wall beside an archer and fetched arrows from the barrel because it kept his hands moving. And when the man with the bow hit a white thing with a long spear in its hand, Tyrion felt a sudden clean joy so bright it frightened him into remembering to breathe. The Godswood was quiet, not because it was safe, but because the trees were watching. Bran had learned that there are times to be a lever and times to be a nail. He had been the lever when the horn sounded. He was the nail now. He held to the heart tree and spoke in the language none of them had forgotten and none of them had learned. The roots moved. It was a movement so slow a man could only know it because he had kept his hand on the bark for a very long time. The roots were making something. They were knitting the ground into a net that would hold a shape when it fell. The pale cold thickened like breath turned back upon itself. Jon felt Balerion's body tense under him, as if the dragon had remembered an old wound. The cold that thinks came forward. It wore a form for men to understand, tall, thin, crowned with a rim of frozen language. It raised a hand, and the wind raised with it, and the fire nearest its hand shrank and went out. Balerion lowered his head until Jon felt the dragon's neck crest brush his knee. There was a way men used to kill monsters, put a metal bit in their mouths and drive iron through the brain. There was no bit for this. Jon stood up on the dragon's neck and stepped forward until he was on the bridge of bone between the eyes. And then he leaped. It was not a great leap, and he would not have gone far if the wind had not heaved him. He came down on the snow and rolled and came up, and the pale figure watched him with a detached interest. Longclaw burned. No one had heeded it. Gendry had inlaid it with lines of dragonglass powder, hammering the glass into grooves with blows so delicate he had bled for the restraint of them, and Daenerys had kissed the blade, and Balerion had breathed on it until the steel had glowed and not softened, and then they had cooled it in a trough where the water had run red for a moment. Steel is a memory, and the sword remembered the shape it had been asked to hold when it saw the cold that would erase it. Jon advanced. The figure raised its spear, and the long white-bladed point was a statement the world had taken too seriously for too long. Jon met it. The two metals kissed, and the kiss sent a crack through the world you could hear with your teeth. He cut. The spear took the cut. It had not forgotten its work. The second cut met what was for a moment a neck, and the neck remembered it had once borne a head. The head fell back and did not fall off. The third cut went lower, and the belly opened as if there were a belly there, and cold light poured out like smoke in a shape of nothing. The roots of the Godswood moved. The ground under the figure yielded. It stepped back, and the ground took the step and gave it no purchase. The net of roots closed like a snare. It bound the cold long enough for one heartbeat to pass in which men could be brave if they chose. And in that heartbeat Jon put Longclaw through the place you would place a blade in a man if you wanted him to die with his hands still at his sides. The figure stilled. Then it shattered into 1,000 spicules of white that settled and melted on the dark. And the thing the lesser dead had been listening to was gone. They fell where they were, and that was not pretty. They do not fall gracefully. They do not lay themselves down as if to sleep. They buckle and shear and crumple as if something had insulted their shape and they had given up having one. The storm paused. It did not go away. Took a breath. Jon fell to one knee and put a hand to the snow, and his hand sank into it up to the wrist, and the cold ran up his arm and into his chest, and for a moment he thought his heart had mislaid its beat. He pulled his hand free and shook it and stood and found he had been crying without knowing it. The tears had frozen to his beard, and the tiny pins of ice pricked his skin. Balerian's head came down and pressed Jon between horn and jaw as if to say, very softly, "Enough." Daenerys was there then. He had not seen her arrive. Drogon's tail lashed, drawing black arcs through snow that hissed at that heat. Her face was not the face she wore in councils. It was a face men wore in birth and death, when the body decides truths the mind cannot touch. She took Jon by the arm, and he realized he had not felt his legs for a while and let her steady him. Around them men were shouting. There are a few kinds of shouting. This was not grief. This was the sound men make when they realize they have not died. The rest was not easy. It took 3 days to burn all that would burn. The specters had broken and fled into the storm, which had moved north like a wounded beast. The fallen of the living were many. Names made a long roll, and the rolled parchment had to be joined to another and another. Yora lay in the godswood with blood drying on his throat and smiled at nothing anyone else could see. He had been allowed the fight he wanted, and the person he wanted to die for had let him do it. The hound sat with his back to a warm stone and did not speak. He had not brought down a dead thing with a fire-wreathed hand and had lived anyway, and it confused him. Sansa slept 20 minutes and woke and went back to the counting. Sam found Jon after and gave him the coin. "I didn't want to hold it anymore," he said. "You take it. You're better with heavy things." Jon turned it over. He did not ask what debt it paid. He had a guess. He looked for Balerion and found him on the hill beyond the winter town, crouched like a mountain, wings of fallen night. The dragon lifted his head and watched him come. He had learned a little High Valyrian. "Zyri jar moriat syz ixen," he said. It was not good. It was as much as a man will learn when he cares for meaning more than grammar. It meant something like, "You have always been good to me." The dragon breathed, and it was a sound like the sea making friends with a river. The debt was not taken then. It was taken later at Long Lake, where the storm had gone to mend itself. The surviving others had gathered there. Fewer than before, but more than men liked to count. They had learned something from their ruin. They no longer paraded. They came in slow, spread out, in a white that makes men doubt their own eyes. The living followed, not like hounds after a hart, but like farmers after a fire, keeping their distance, making sure nothing the flame had spared would take the field later. The dragon circled and tested the storm and fell back and tested again. The lake had frozen until it was a city. The cold was not just on it. It was in it like thought through a mind. At the far end of the ice, a thing rose that was not built by hands. It rose out of the lake like an organ does out of flesh when pressed. A swell the size of a keep, dark within and crusted over in white like scab. The dragons hammered it with fire, and the flame slid off and rolled away, sullied by the cold. This was something older than either element, a kind of question the world had asked itself when it was young and had never answered. Balerion came to the ice and lay his jaw against it. He did not breathe. He listened. There is a sound stone makes when it is very cold and very old. It creaks like a house nobody has lived in for a century when someone sits on the front step. The dragon listened until the listening had the shape of a decision. He looked up at Jon. Sam's coin was in Jon's glove. He closed his hand on it until the hand hurt. "Is there no other way?" he asked, though there was no one there to answer who would give him a lie. Daenerys came down beside him on Drogon and looked into his face. "I don't know the word for other anymore," she said. There were tears frozen in her hair, and she had not felt them. "I only know this." He nodded. He kissed her. It was not a kiss to be remembered in a song. It was a kiss that puts breath in a man before he dives. He turned and climbed Balerion again, and the dragon raised his head and shook the snow out of the grooves of his neck and went up. He did not breathe fire at the thing in the lake. He took air in as if he meant to drink the sky, and then he gave a cry that had in it all the iron of the freehold. The scream of stone poured, the laugh of a man who had finally killed his enemy and found himself alone. He folded his wings and dropped. Jon leaped from his neck at the last half-breath. He had not planned to. He did it because the body does things when the mind is busy. He landed on ice that suggested a hide and cut at once. Without looking, without allowing himself the mercy of surviving a moment more than necessary. Longclaw went in and found something like a heart the size of a small house, hard and laced with nothing that wanted warmth, and the sword kept going into it as if the steel had become more than steel. It did not burn. It simply was what it was, a memory that would not be erased. The thing in the lake groaned. The sound was low and small for its size, and that made it worse. John P. Yuled the sword free and fell, and the ice gave and took him into a black that was not water so much as the absence of it. He kicked and found nothing. Then something took him by the back of his cloak and pulled. He came up through slush and breathing and light and a heat that bit like dogs whose teeth are doing you good. Balerion was unraveling. He did not burst into flame. He did not fall into ash. The dragon became the thing fire becomes when it stands up, a figure taller than the mountain he had come from, and around him the air sagged as if relieved of a burden and reluctant to give it up. He looked at Jon with an eye that had become a coal that had begun to thin. He lowered his head until his brow touched Jon's shoulder, a weight that would have broken a house, and Jon could bear it because for 1 second the dragon remembered him, and memory has weight and men can bear weight when it is given like that. Then the dragon's shape fell in on itself with a sigh like winter turning, and the flame that had been him ran in lines along the cracks in the ice and in the lines of men's hands and warmed all the parts that had been cold so long they had forgotten to complain. The storm went slack, like a sail when the wind does a kindness at last. The ice on the lake broke in plates and turned and knocked again like door, softer and softer. The specters that had remained flickered and went out. The dead who had not yet fallen fell, and the dead who had fallen seemed to settle further into the ground, as if their old beds had taken them back. Men stood very still. A woman cried and covered her mouth with both hands, because she had not meant to make a sound and was ashamed of having done it. Ghost licked Jon's face. Jon lay on his back and watched the sky, and the sky was not blue yet and not red, and for the first time in many days, he did not feel compelled to follow either color. Daenerys came down beside him. She sat in the wet, freezing slush with him and took his hand and did not ask if he was dying. If he had been, it would not have been her question to ask. She looked where the dragon had come apart and said nothing. Drogon set his head down behind them and blew out, and the breath rolled over them like blankets, and they were still cold. After a while she said, "He was not yours and he was not mine." "He was ours for a while," Jon said. "That may be enough," she answered. The spring came not in a rush but in the wary manner of something that has been punished for showing itself too early. The snows withdrew by days and by nights, and there was much to uncover. Bones of men and horses, spears whose heads had not shattered and could be used again, broken harness, barreled butter ruined and thrown to grateful dogs, letters from wives and letters to wives, candles that would never burn. They buried the dead in rings around the weirwood until the gods would look like a target and men avoided looking at it. They built a mound farther off for those whose faith ran differently, and no one policed the border between. In winter men divide themselves into small truths. In the wake of winter they are glad of larger ones. Sansa sent grain south and north and east and to the men who had been their enemies. She did not send letters with it. She sent gold, because gold is the only letter some read in spring. Tyrion went to King's Landing with Davos, and with him a promise that could be mistaken for an insult if you were looking for one. Cersei received them and walked them through the skulls again and asked after the health of their monsters. "I am so relieved," she said when told the greatest was gone. "I do so love an equal world." She gave up nothing and gave the impression of having been generous. Afterward, in the boat, Davos said there will be another war whether we want it or not, and Tyrion said the only mercy is that I will not live long enough to be blamed for it. At Old Town, Lord Leighton went up the tower 3 times a day and once at night and stood by his hatefully beautiful light and wanted to keep it burning forever, and Malora told him he would go blind and mad, and he said gently, "Yes, dear, that is the plan." The beacon was dimmed finally, not put out. It burned low for ships and for men who look to towers and say that is the shape of a promise. Sam reshelved the books that had not burned and taught Kiss Me Gilly to read a little and their boy to count shells. He finished his letter to Jon and did not send it. He folded it into a book and passed the book to a scribe with soft hands who rolled the words into the margins of histories. and Jon's name became smaller than a man's thumb, and that is how history loves you. In Dorne, the Eulers put a new roof on the vault that had opened under their keep and did not boast of the dead dragon they had killed 100 years past. You do not boast when your house's shadow is newly enlarged by a truth you cannot deny. They spoke of water and dates and the fairness of the sun and taught their children how to sash a blade. At the God's Eye a fisherman found a scale and brought it to the blacksmith at Harrenhal, and the smith tried to melt it and could not, and set it in his wall and never spoke of it. The fisher died old with his hands smelling of onion weed, and the story passed into a place where stories sometimes live better than facts. The dragons that remained flew on. Drogon hunted again in the Rainwood and came back with a wild boar in his mouth and a puncture in his wing from a spear thrown by a man who could not believe his own luck. Rhaegal found a mate in the hills of the Vale, or something like a mate, and riders down in the lowlands told how a green shadow furrowed the earth one afternoon and set fire to a hillside full of junipers, and the scent lingered for a week and someone bottled it and sold it in pentos as the breath of kings. Vagor flew east not for Valyria but for islands men did not chart, and sometimes in the evening a fisherman on the narrow sea would look up and see her silhouette against a moon that had fattened itself, and he would go home happier for not knowing the name of the shadow that had blessed him. Meraxes slept in the Dornish sands under the half-moon like a lover, and when she woke and shook the sand from her head, the sand fell back with a sound like applause. The Dornish did not build scorpions along the Prince's Pass. They put clay pipes to carry water farther into their orchards. The North planted. The crows on the plowed fields looked like spilled ink, a waste of words. Sansa took counsel under the heart tree and then in the solar, and Bran told her the roots were content in a way that made men weep when she said it aloud. Arya left without telling anyone when she would return. Gendry put his hammer down only when his hands would not close at night and he had to warm them in a kettle. Davos went home long enough to find that home had become the place he longed for when he was away from it, and that satisfied him more than coin. Tyrion wrote a long letter to his brother and never sent it. Jaime could not have read it anyway. Jon walked the ground where the dragon had come apart. At first his steps were heavy, then they were not. He came without Ghost sometimes and sometimes with. He did not speak to anyone about what he had felt when the weight had rested a moment on his shoulder. To speak of it would have given the wrong weight to the words. He knelt and put a hand to the stones and felt their warmth gathered over the day, and in the warmth there was a memory like his own, thin and honest and not asking for anything. Daenerys stood beside him at times and apart at others. She did not ask him to come south. He did not ask her to remain. They had done things one writes down badly. It is cruel to put more demands on the hands that have held such work. I dreamed as a girl that the skulls would speak, she said once, and he knew what she meant, though neither of them had been girls in that place where the skulls had been hung like lanterns. I thought they would teach me how to be a queen. They taught you how to be something else, Jon said, and then made you teach yourself to be a queen. I don't know if I have that in me, she said, and he smiled, not because he found it amusing, but because the truth sometimes makes the face do that. You have dragons, he said simply. Fewer than I did, she said. More than anyone else, he answered. She reached up and with her forefinger brushed a flake of nothing from his cheek. It might have been ash. It might have been snow. It might have been something smaller than either, a remnant of a thing no longer here. We live, she said. That is a great weight to carry. I had better grow stronger. He took her hand and squeezed it, the careful squeeze of a man who has let go of too many things too fast. We will grow as the ground permits, he said, which is the sort of thing a farmer might say and a king should, though they rarely do. They stood long until the shadows lengthened and lay together like old swords retired to a wall. They did not see a sign in the sky and they did not hear a horn that told them what to do. The wind moved and the grass moved, and a hawk practiced being a hawk over the long field, and that was the message. The world was, and soon it would be itself again. When night came, a woman with hair like smoke knelt by a dying fire in a place where the sea speaks less and the land more, and she breathed into oil. The flames showed shadows of things that had been and things that might be and things the flames would not commit to. Melisandre watched until her eyes watered, and she could not say whether she was seeing the future or her own desire. She laughed softly to the flames and said, "You are poor companions and rich teachers." She slept and dreamed of a dragon's shadow passing over snow, and of a boy blowing a horn in a hall of black glass, and of an old woman lighting a tower. When she woke, the fire had gone out, and she did not trouble herself to rekindle it. Dawn can light itself. The dawn did. It broke over Winterfell in a pale line that widened and gained courage as it crossed the yard. In the gods wood it set a rim of light on each red leaf until the weirwood's face looked younger. In the town the dogs groaned and rose, and men turned on their pallets like bread trying to brown evenly. On the field beyond the outer wall, where the ground had been not long ago a white sheet, there were shoots of green that had decided this was their day. They would forget the cold soon. That is what green things do. Men forget more slowly, and hold some memories like coals under ash in case the night returns. Above it all, farther than any bell, the sky showed a thin scar darker than the rest, the ghost of a shadow great enough to make cities doubt themselves. It slid across the morning, and those who looked up felt for a moment that they had been recognized by something they were not inclined to name. Passed into light, the day held, and the world, which often does not deserve what it is given, deserved this.